very much. It's really a great pleasure and an honour to be here, starting off today's presentations. I want to start by asking you just to think about what you think a child needs in order to thrive. So what's the first thing that comes into your head when you think about that? And I'd like to have time to, gather everybody's thoughts, but I know I'm going to be held strictly to my 15 minutes. So I'm going to hazard a guess, or I'm going to tell you the first thing that comes into my head is what a child needs is love, affection, warmth, strong relationships with their carers. That's the first thing. If we start to think then beyond that, what more do they need? I think we'd start to think, well, they need an education, they need health, they need to socialise and play with other children, and then if I had space for more pictures, we'd start to think they need to be able to come to spaces like this and be inspired by the creative arts, have the opportunity perhaps not just to sit on that side, but also sometimes to be on this side and learn to dance and to sing and so on. In fact, what I want to talk about mainly today, I think we'll be talking about all of these things through the day, but is something else that we might have thought of. They need adequate resources, financial resources in their family. And the reason that I want to focus largely on this is, well, there are three reasons. The first is that we know that this is really important, and I'll talk a little bit about research evidence on that this is fundamental to making sure that all children can enjoy all of the other things that they need in order to thrive. The second reason is that this is something actually that government can do something about relatively easily compared to some of the other things that we might want to ensure that children have. And I'll talk a bit about that. And the third reason is that this is really a problem at the moment. So increasing numbers of families, as Kirsty's already highlighted, do not have adequate resources. And I know that all of you who work with children will probably be aware of this increasingly, of the circumstances that children are coming from and the way that that's affecting their ability to benefit from the things that you're offering them. So a little bit about the research. I mean, we've known for a really long time that children who grow up in households with low incomes do less well than children from households who have more. So their health is worse, they are less likely to do well in school, and therefore later on in the labour market, and their social and emotional development is often also worse. But when children in low-income households do less well, we don't necessarily know that it's the income that makes a difference. So sometimes people have argued, well, there are other things that go along with that. They might have parents who have lower levels of education, for example, and so those parents are doing less to help them, they're less able to help them in school, maybe raising aspirations for them to a lesser extent. But increasingly, research is really able to unpick some of these things. And I've done a big review of literature which really tries to look at the studies which tell us what we know about the effect of money itself in households. So I'm pretty confident in telling you that we know that there may be lots of other things that are important as well, but that money is one of the reasons, money itself is one of the reasons why children in poor households do less well. And so these are studies, I can't talk in detail, that track children over time in situations where where their income rises for reasons that are nothing to do with the family's responsibility. So for example, there's a change in the benefits system, which means families receive more over time, or there's a rise in the minimum wage, families receive more over time, and researchers track over time what happens to children, and they see that their outcomes improve. So we know that this is really fundamental. Why does it matter? Why does it make a difference? There are really two sort of big theories, and we find evidence in the literature for both of these theories. And at the risk, first of all, of stating the very obvious, one reason that money matters is that it enables parents to buy the things for their children that they need in order to thrive. So a healthy food, warm housing, and then things going beyond the basics in order to trips out, books, access to the internet, the ability to come here perhaps and watch a play or a ballet. And we also know that where parents receive more income, they spend this money on their children. So these things happen more where families have enough money to provide them. But the second theory is a little bit less obvious until you start to think about it, and it turns out to be, if anything, more important than the first one, which we call the investment model. Money also matters because it's able to change the emotional environment in the household. So when we go back to the thing I put up first, love, affection, money doesn't buy love, but it does give parents the space and the ability to be able to focus on their children without the other concerns. And I think any of us who are parents and you've ever been stressed about something, whether it's money or something to do with work or something else, you know that it's much harder, if you're worrying about something, to listen to your child tell you about their school day, about something that happens, to help them with their homework, to impose sort of boundaries and bedtimes in a calm way. So if you're thinking about what's for dinner today, what's for dinner tomorrow, how am I going to get through to the end of the week, then it's much, much harder to give your child what they need in that sense. And again, the research really backs this up. So poverty has a strong causal relationship with anxiety, with maternal depression, and other measures of stress. Okay, so what's been happening to child poverty? I'm now going to give you a very brief, potted history of the last 60 years. Just to give a bit of context, so if we go back to the 60s and 70s, this is a poverty measure. It's a relative poverty measure. It's the standard one used across European countries. And you can see that back in the 60s, we had very sort of and 70s, kind of stable poverty. It could have been better. We're talking between 10 and 15%. But this placed us we were very average for Europe. We're very similar to other European countries. And then something happens in the 80s, which many of you will know, perhaps even remember. We had a very radical government who made major changes to employment and to social security, so cuts to benefits, cuts to taxes, lifting much tougher requirements on unions, and that really had dramatic effects. It shifted Britain in terms of both poverty and inequality from being an average European country to being much more similar to the United States in terms of those measures. You see that big mountain there. And we then see, though, that started to come down over the following decade, which I'll say a bit about, and it then starts to rise again. And this is the context we're now in, this turnaround in poverty. What happened 20 years ago? We had a prime minister who looked very young when you look at him now. 20 years ago this year, he made this pledge, and it's sort of poignant to present this now because he was talking about a 20-year ambition to eradicate child poverty. Our historic aim will be ours to be the first generation to end child poverty. It will take a generation, but I believe it can be done. And politicians, of course, make these kinds of pledges all the time, but he and Gordon Brown took this one very seriously, and they introduced a range of policies that made some improvements to the levels of parents working, particularly lone parents. But most importantly, they introduced something called the child tax credit system, still here today in some guise, which made a huge difference and put much more money in the pockets of families, both in work and out of work. Particularly families with younger children benefited, and particularly lone parents felt these increases. Oh. How? I didn't do anything, I promise. Okay, someone's taken manual control for me, that's good. Great, so thank you. At the same time, investment in Sure Start, in services, Sure Start, early education, and so on. So we have policy action making a difference, and you see child poverty coming down over that decade. And we then see it starting to rise in recent years. If we focus in on particular types of family, you see this even more starkly. So the sorts of families that benefited are also the families that are really feeling the squeeze at the moment. So up there in the top left-hand corner, you can see families who don't have a parent in work. That's often because they're a lone parent with a young child, or because there are health issues and disabilities. And you can see, firstly, very sharp improvements in that, and then you can see sharp deterioration. in the last 4 or 5 years. Similarly, lone parents in green there as opposed to couples. And finally, larger families are also big beneficiaries under the Labour government and are really seeing, it's larger families that are really bearing the brunt of the situation now. So if you know families where there are 3 children or more children, those families very, very likely are going to be having a much tougher time than they were. Briefly, what's happening? Again, quite a lot of different policies are hitting families at the same time, but the 2 or 3 things I want to highlight that are worth kind of knowing that are really driving a lot of this. One of them is that there's been a freeze in working age benefits, a cash freeze, since 2015. So traditionally, benefits rise every year with inflation. Since 2015, that hasn't happened, and they are the same in cash terms. This is a sort of dry-sounding thing that doesn't really catch the headlines, what's happening with benefit uprating, but it really makes a difference month on month, year on year, to the value of the pounds in people's pockets. Prices are rising more than expected, linked to Brexit, and the cash is staying the same. So this is tough. The second really big change, which some of you may know about, is that in tax credits and in universal credit when it comes in, there's now a limit. So you only get support for your first 2 children. If you have a 3rd child, a 4th child, you don't get any additional support for that child if they're born after April 2017. So this is only just starting to take effect, but you can see from the figure I presented you, we're already seeing that sharp rise for these larger families, and this is going to get worse year on year. And this is a really significant shift in the way we provide support for families. So instead of giving families what we calculate they need, making a sort of moral judgment about, you should have really thought about this. You should have really thought about whether you could afford to have 3 children. And you should have thought in ahead that whether you would ever need support from the state. Would you ever be a lone parent? Would you ever have a health problem, become unemployed, and so on? And looking ahead, there are also problems, transition problems with universal credit that we may start to feel. The 2-child limit, there was a report out this week, some of you may have seen, it got lots of press coverage from the Child Poverty Action Group and the Church of England, and they've interviewed families who are starting to feel the squeeze, starting to be affected by this policy. And I've got here a few quotes from some of those families. And you can see, I think this speaks back to the investment model and the family stress model that I presented you with earlier. So here's a really good example, bad example of the investment model. Here's a child, 2 children who they've had a baby born in their family, they've got a new sibling, exciting, wonderful thing, but as a result of that, as a direct result of that, they can no longer attend their basketball and their football. And in this family, there was a bit of tension. You know, the children were sort of blaming that. They could see that this was because the new baby had arrived, that they could no longer do their football. Not being able to afford baby milk. And here we start to see also the sort of stress effects that this is having on the family. The mother's in tears because she cannot afford this. And again, here, it just causes me unnecessary worry and stress. I spend my whole life worrying. So we look at the big numbers and you can see what's happening in terms of how many people this is affecting, and then this helps us to see what this means to an individual family. So if you were different, I mean, one thing that's frustrating about this, as I've said, is that we can see from what happened so sharply to those changes in child poverty, this is something that's quite easy for government to do something about. So simply reversing these changes, the reforms of the last few years, would make a huge difference. And now that we're seeing talk of, tax cuts that cost 9, 10, 11 billion pounds, suddenly it seems like there is money to do this kind of thing if there was political will. But setting that aside, if this is the context, are there ways that we can try to prevent the financial circumstances of families from impacting on children's lives? Now, obviously, there are limits to the extent that we can do that because this affects what happens within families. But of course, public services can provide a sort of buffer and try to insulate children from these effects. Certainly when a child enters school for the day, this should be irrelevant. This should all fall away, and the difference between what their family income is should not matter. And I know schools do in many cases, a really terrific job of this. But I think there are also cases where that's not the case, and that it does matter. And I think sometimes schools are not aware enough of when they ask children for money for school trips, for outings, for proms, what this is going to mean, the knock-on effects for children who will and won't be able to go, and what this might mean in terms of additional stress at home. It's also the case that, I think schools are increasingly perhaps turning to parents because they are themselves very squeezed. So I think the wider context of austerity, of course, has to be kept in mind. So we know, for example, spending on healthcare, primary healthcare has fallen 4% between 2011 and 2016, and school spending 8% in real terms, both in real terms. In fact, in the wider context, these are actually, this is meaningful, certainly particularly, in both cases it's meaningful. It's actually relatively small when we compare this to the ways that other services have been squeezed. And many of you may be involved with services that were funded through local authorities. That's where really the toughest squeeze is happening. So you can see here the local authorities experience big cuts, 40% cuts in terms of their overall budgets over this period that I'm showing here. And essentially what that's meant is that they've had to really pull back and focus much more predominantly on their statutory things, the things that they absolutely have to do, and social care is one of them. So spending on children's social care has risen a little bit because local authorities have to do that, and also because there are probably more demands on it as a result of, for example, changes in the increases in poverty. But you can see what I've done here is just pull out, not selectively, all of the headline, all of the spending items which most affect children from the National Audit Office's report of local authority spending, and you can see that really, really serious cuts to some of these services. Sure Start and services. Sure Start is a particularly large one, so that's a lot of money. Some of the other areas, such as arts development and support, was a relatively small fund, but it's taken a 40% cut from that small fund. So all of these things combined with what's happening to family incomes, of course, are making it much tougher to make sure that every single child has what they need to thrive. But I don't want to end by, I'm aware that I've started the day on a really down note, for which I apologise. So I hope that the day today will be able to generate positive energy and think about, this is the context, but let's think about what we can do within this context to make sure that children really have what they need. And like Kirsty, I wanted to end with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, 30 years old this year, really inspiring documents. It's worth having a read to get ourselves geared up. And the whole thing is inspiring, but I've pulled out 3 articles which I think particularly pertinent to what I've spoken about and what we're speaking out today. So every child has the right to an adequate standard of living to meet their needs and also their development. They have the right to relax, play and take part in cultural and artistic activities. And everything we are doing we should be making our decisions with the best interests of the child at heart. Thank you.